Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, March 29th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about the statehood movement in Puerto Rico. And before we get into it, I want to actually tell you that I'm using a new microphone to record this video. It's a brand new one. I've been using the same one since 2017. So what you're hearing me is on a brand new microphone. I've turned the volume up quite significantly, I think, to a point where if you turn it up to maximum volume, it's not as low as it was before. So it puts it around a point where you can listen to this around medium volume. Now tell me if this is too high. I'm going to keep the volume for the remainder of this video. I will adjust it as needed, but I do think that the sound itself is very high quality and that I do sound the same. I'm glad that I don't sound tremendously different. But the volume was the main factor in me getting a new microphone. The one before I used only went up to the highest point being my previous videos, meaning it got no higher than that. So I decided to go ahead and invest in a new microphone, and I'm hoping that this one actually ends up working out. Otherwise, I might end up returning it, but so far I'm pretty happy with it. So let me know your comments down below. But I've already wasted a minute of your time. Let's go ahead and get started about what my main point of this video is going to be. And we're pretty much just going to be discussing Puerto Rican statehood. I think that this is something that will be slowly climbing up in the national news media as the District of Columbia is the closest ever that it's been to becoming the 51st state in the United States. And I'm sure that many of us know that if DC does become a state, that the Democratic Party will add two new Senate seats and one new House seat. But Puerto Rico, a territory in the United States that doesn't pay federal taxes as the District of Columbia does, but does pay a lot of money into other things for the United States, and ultimately has a very large amount of people on this in the Commonwealth here. You know, we're talking about Puerto Rico having more citizens, American citizens, than 21 other states, according to the statehood movement here. It's very interesting to see that a territory, even if it is a territory with such a large population, has been lagging behind many other or on par with many other statehood movements. And I think that, you know, Puerto Rico's sheer prominence in terms of overall population would actually put it above the District of Columbia. There's nothing saying that a state must be continuous, for example, Alaska and Hawaii, but of course it does come down to congressional approval, and that's exactly what Puerto Rico would need to do. Now, Puerto Rican statehood is not something new to the American public. Presidents, Republicans, Democrats alike have all said that they have come out in support of Puerto Rico and pretty much becoming a state, and pretty much have given it up to the people in this in the Commonwealth here. And, you know, looking at the referendums, what we know is that since 1967, we've been seeing referendums across the entire island itself. I mean, we've probably seen referendums before, but they only started gaining traction until now, once they started actually voting for statehood here. In 2012, what did we see happen? I can actually show you more detailed results. Statehood was preferred over independence and free association here, where most of voters said that it should not continue its current territory status. They were longing for something new, and 61.16% of voters here said they want to go to statehood. Well, in 2017, the anti-statehood movement boycotted such a referendum, but it ultimately ended up with 97.13% of the voting here going to statehood, with 1.52% to independence and free association, and 1.35% to current territorial status. 2020 rolls around, a high turnout year across the country, including Puerto Rico. The majority of voters turned out, 54.72%, and statehood passes 52.52% of the vote here. You know, over 500,000 votes for both sides here, and the yes vote takes away, with 655,505 Puerto Rican citizens, American citizens at that, voting for statehood for the island itself. So looking at the territory here, it seems as if it is very clear that they want statehood. We've seen arguments come from both members of the right wing and the left wing to allow Puerto Rico to decide, but spoiler alert, they already have multiple times. And, you know, while there is that issue of whether or not they're truly informed about what statehood would actually mean, at the end of the day, these voters made their conscious decision to approve of statehood on multiple occasions. And I don't think it's fair for congressional members, Republicans or Democrats, to go ahead and say from Washington, D.C., that Puerto Rico should not become a state, at the same point arguing that Washington, D.C. should become a state. Either you're against both or you're for both. At this point, I think it really comes down to what the congressional Democrats can do for Puerto Rico and whether or not they truly want this territory to become a state. because, Puerto Rican statehood has been introduced for quite some time now. Certainly quite some time now. And, Puerto Rican statehood isn't something that would be universally opposed by the Democratic Party. Most Democrats support Puerto Rican and D.C. statehood. But the problem is more Democrats support D.C. statehood, and that hasn't even happened yet. But as we take a look at what's happening here, Puerto Rico, first of all, has a non-voting member of Congress. They do not have anyone that can directly impact the outcome of the voting results there. So when it comes down to impeachment, they can't vote. When it comes down to important bills, they can't vote. When it comes down to the stimulus package, they can't vote, even though they will benefit from it, and in many cases, consequence from the actions of Congress. And, we have over 1 million American citizens here with no voting representation. And there are plenty of other territories in a very similar predicament. So looking at this Puerto Rican statehood, it's pretty much just going to be an intentional way for whichever party, it doesn't really matter, to just get Puerto Rican representation from the island over to Washington, D.C., because right now they have a non-voting delegate, but it really means nothing. It just really means not much if you can't actually end up voting, which is the unfortunate reality. But so far, we're seeing that there actually is some crossover support here amongst Democrats and Republicans, and I'll actually point out the statehood vote, because what you see there is that, many of the more left-wing citizens in Puerto Rico aren't exactly in favor of statehood, but rather in favor of becoming completely independent, or, becoming not a territory, but separating itself from the United States, but still able to remain within its vicinity. I think that, just looking at the options here, what we're seeing is that a lot of traditional and conservative Puerto Rican voters want DC statehood combined with a more liberal part of the electorate, with a pretty significant portion still opposing it at the end of the day. But majority does rule in this country, and majority does rule in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, and I think that it is very interesting to see. So looking at this why statehood argument, it's pretty much just saying that since they don't have representation in Congress, yes, they do not have to pay federal income taxes, but they pay payroll taxes. They are helping with Medicaid. They are helping with Supplement Security Income, the Supplement Nutrient Assistance Program, Earned Income Tax Credit, a lot of things that are, very prevalent in regular states that are also prevalent in Puerto Rico. On top of that, I think that we are looking at Puerto Rico really longing to have that care from the American government that it would have if it was a state. Because, after Hurricane Maria in 2017, if Puerto Rico was a state, it would have gotten a lot more aid than it did. And I think that it's really coming down to a point where Puerto Rico is asking for more help from the American government, and the American government is not exactly returning the favor. Not necessarily the favor, but sort of answering their calls of just simply getting help for the island itself in very dire times, simply because, states are always going to be prioritized over commonwealths, which is something that disenfranchises the over, 1 million citizens in this, I almost keep saying this state of Puerto Rico, in the Commonwealth here. But then we see members of the Democratic Party calling for different things, saying, they should be able to decide, allowing them to explore different options more than they already have. Well, I'm telling you now, when we do see more and more statehood referendums start to pop up, you're going to see the same exact results. You're going to see statehood pass time and time again, as we've seen for the past few decades. And I don't think that should become too surprising for many people. But essentially, now that we understand where Puerto Rico sort of stands at this point, this would be very beneficial for the Democratic Party in terms of its immediate implications. Because chances are the Republican Party is going to oppose this, at least on a national level. And while there may be some crossover support from Republicans in states such as Florida, because, heavy Puerto Rico population, or in majority Hispanic districts at that, where we're seeing a very significant portion of the electorate there support Puerto Rican statehood, what we might see is that there will be a few crossover votes in states such as Florida and states that are in have a very large Hispanic population and a very large Puerto Rican population. For example, Florida's a perfect example. Texas is another. Overall, just Hispanic populations could, go out as far as saying that it would have an impact on Arizona's voters, on Colorado voters, New Mexico, Nevada, California. And I think that it largely is important for a lot of these constituents, and that many representatives are going to be listening to that and saying, you know what, even though I'm a Republican, I will vote for this. But on the national level, I can imagine that the Republican Party would be opposed to it in the same way they're opposed to DC statehood. And they cannot actively call for Puerto Rican statehood and not DC statehood, at least in terms of hoping to not seem hypocritical. You know, obviously that is completely possible. Politicians are free to do whatever they want, but politically speaking, it just simply doesn't make sense. But once we do see that, I think that the Democratic Party will be much more accepting of a potential Puerto Rican 51st or 52nd state than they would be, and then the Republican Party would be. I think we're going to start to see some, number one, xenophobic comments, which really wouldn't make sense, but I think that there is going to be this whole divide saying, you know, members of the right wing arguing that Puerto Rico isn't, you know, technically part of America. It isn't a part of the original 50 states that we've had for the past half century. At the end of the day, I think we're going to see a very clear divide between those who want Puerto Rican statehood and those who do not. And I think that the Republican Party, while conservative members of Puerto Rico's constituents might want representation and want statehood, I think on the national level, the Republican Party is going to look at this and say the Democratic Party is going to benefit. Because if you're looking at the numbers in terms of those who are Puerto Rican citizens in this country, we see that they back the Democratic Party 71-22. That is a 49-point margin amongst Puerto Rican citizens in this country. Those born in Puerto Rico that are now in swing states, that are now on the national level voting in the regular American elections. That is very important to note. If we're looking at a point where Puerto Rican citizens that are in the, they're all in the United States, but are in parts of the United States where you can actually get electoral representation, and they're backing Democrats 71-22, even though they may be socially conservative, there are plenty of demographic groups in this country that are socially conservative, yet still back the Democratic Party. You know, that is a very that is a very common thing to see. I that is real. There are also liberal voters that vote for the Republican Party. It's just a very weird thing to see. But looking at Puerto Rican citizens here, 71-22 is something that the GOP will largely be afraid of, because even though they may be able to tap into Puerto Rico's socially conservative portion and, you know, just overall belief set, which obviously I'm not trying to treat Puerto Rico as a monolith, but I am going to be very frank that we do see typically minority voters, all people of color, hold socially conservative beliefs, yet still back the Democratic Party at high rates. And I think that Puerto Rican voters are no different. And while what we're seeing now may suggest that the Democrats will have a complete lockdown on the new state as they would in D.C., I think it's completely possible for the GOP to win there in the future. But the immediate implication would be that the Democratic Party gets a boost. They get a boost on the Senate level. They get a boost on the presidential level. I'm going to go ahead and just characterize all of the states that were won by Joe Biden and Donald Trump in the 2020 election and pretty much just show you what Puerto Rico being introduced would actually do. And since it is a would-be state with, you know, over 1 million citizens, it's going to have a very large amount of electoral votes, at least relative to other states. So it's going to have around 7, at least off current estimations. And what that means essentially is that it would be 7 more Democratic electoral votes at this point. So 306 to 232 on this new map that we would see, Puerto Rico would add 7 electoral votes to the Democrats, propping them up to 313. Now, on the 2024 map, which is what will be used in 2024, of course, and 2028, we will see a decrease in terms of the overall electoral votes counted right now for the Democrats by 4, and an increase for Republicans by 4 based off current estimations. But the main takeaway is that Democrats will have this buffer and have a larger electoral win on top of what was already a pretty significant win, at least if 2016 was considered significant enough. So what 7 electoral votes would do, it actually would do a lot. The Republicans could win Arizona. They could win Georgia. They could win even a state such as Michigan. And, you know, sorry, not Michigan. I clicked the wrong state. They could win a state such as, you know, Wisconsin, and the Democrats would still win. You know, the Democrats would still be able to win. If this was a regular type of map, it would go to a tie, and the Republicans would end up winning because of their state control. And, you know, looking at the Rust Belt region here, I think that it's very possible that we could come down to an election where Puerto Rico would be that deciding group that ultimately would land the Democratic Party, at least initially, in the majority. And also, not to mention what would happen in the United States Senate. What we're seeing here is that a 50-50 tie if DC statehood is introduced. What this would actually add is DC statehood would add, more votes on top of let's go ahead and see. Let's make that 5 there just so we can actually do things correctly. I'm going to use Maryland, for example, just because it's my home state. I think it's a good state to use. I love Maryland, right? So looking at it, what we would see is with Puerto Rican statehood and with DC statehood, we would see the Democrats at a 54 to 50 majority. 52 would be needed for a majority. The Democrats would have a majority of 2 rather than 0. If DC statehood passes, it'll be a majority of 1. If Puerto Rico statehood passes as well, it'll be a majority of 2. The Democratic Party will have an immediate bump simply because the Democratic Party will be the favored party in Puerto Rico, at least initially. The Democratic Party seems to be one of the most prominent members calling for Puerto Rican statehood. And I think that as we will see, the Republican Party start to realize that even if they do back Puerto Rican statehood, they won't be able to benefit from it. I think they are going to vote against it. I think they are going to try to do everything they can because they can convince some Democrats to block this. But chances are, in doing that, they will screw themselves over in the eyes of many Puerto Rican citizens, at least for the next few decades. Voters do end up forgiving, certain parties at the end of the day. But looking at Puerto Rico, I think that if we start to see a full-blown attack from Mitch McConnell's office or, Rick Scott with the NRSC or from, even Donald Trump against the statehood chances for Puerto Rico, and of course with the District of Columbia, we will see these voters here turn away from the GOP very quickly. And if it does come to a point where they do become a state, the Democratic Party, I think, will have an immediate bump. And based off the numbers that we're seeing amongst Puerto Rican citizens, in voting bodies, I think that the Republican Party should actually be very worried about some of these numbers because it isn't a great indicator that, Puerto Rican citizens are already turned away from the GOP and sort of just indicates to them that, they aren't going to win it. So why not oppose it and why not try to block it so they're able to win it in the future? But if they do block it and it ends up passing, I think that it's just going to be a very unfortunate predicament. Regardless, I think the Democratic Party will start out with the initial advantage in the newly formed state of Puerto Rico, and it will hand the Democrats 2 new Senate seats, 7 new electoral votes on the presidential map, and also 5 new House seats, which will not all be Democratic, so that's why I didn't really talk about it much. It'll likely be split 3-2, 1-4, depending on gerrymandering, or possibly in favor of the GOP, whatever it might be. I just think that overall, we are going to see an immediate bump for the Democratic Party if Puerto Rico statehood is passed. But of course, there's a long ways to go. I just think that it's worth talking about, given that DC statehood is at the highest chance of passing that it's ever been. And I think Puerto Rico statehood might be just a few years behind. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Let me know what you think about my microphone. It's a brand new one, like I said in the beginning of this video. I got it around 8 o'clock a.m. this morning. But overall, I think that it's a pretty nice microphone. I'm hoping that the audio does come out correctly, and I'm hoping you guys enjoy it. So again, let me know down in the comment section down below, and I will see you all tomorrow.